Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time you're watching this recording. My name is Farbod Yousefi. I'm at the Agriculture and Food Global Practice of the World Bank. And it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to share with you a presentation or lecture on the issue of fostering an enabling environment for agribusiness. As I make this recording and send it over to you, I try to imagine each of your faces, each of the people behind the screen, and it certainly gives this technology a human quality and a sense of humanity. So, pleasure to be connecting with you through this means. I wanted to start by perhaps, let me see, I should share my screen, putting some slides up for you and hoping that you'll be able to see them as I go through the presentation. And perhaps I'll start during the first few minutes with just an overview or a background for what I want to get a little bit more into. And I'll start by perhaps referring to what is known or called the agricultural transformation of countries, or the transformation of the agri-food sector of countries around the world. And there's been a matrix that has been developed that shows that as countries evolve and transform their agri-food sector, the percentage of people dedicated to agriculture and the percentage of the contribution of agriculture, its value added to the GDP, they do reduce. And so you find these clusters of countries that go through different stages from agri-based, where agriculture plays a huge role in terms of employment and population activity, and in terms of GDP, and it moves through a pre-transition, transition, urbanizing, and finally developed, where countries, again, the role of agriculture, both in terms of economic activity as well as value added, reduced substantially. I'll try to show you, if we look at the countries clustered up like this, you can actually see in time how they evolve, how they transform, how they move. There's different directions and different trends, but they tend to move towards the urbanizing and developed section in this chart. If we look specifically at India, and maybe just to have some comparators, I've included here some South Asian and Southeast Asian countries. You can see, oops, apologies for that. You can see how India from 1980 has been also moving along this agriculture or agri-food transformation matrix, along with other countries. Some, such as Malaysia and Philippines, are farther along in terms of agricultural transformation, but they all seem to be moving in the same direction, sometimes at different paces. Now, at the same time, it's interesting to kind of overlay that with this piece of information, which is already, a few years old, but still very valid. And it's watching and seeing how agriculture versus agribusiness, their contribution and their ratio when it compares to other sectors and to the total GDP. So in an ag-based country, you have a much larger component, 30% value added comes from agriculture, but and almost 20% in agribusiness. But again, as countries transform, their agricultural sectors transform, you see those sectors, those value addeds reduced. Now, I also want to bring into this backdrop what is the issue with our food systems at a global level. And if you sum up all the costs behind food production globally, the land use system globally, these actually add up to 12 trillion a year. Now, if you add up and you assess and you quantify the market value of the global food system, these add up to 10 trillion. So quite honestly, we're in a scenario, if we account for all the costs, including hidden costs involved in global food production, where our costs are higher than our results, our outputs. And in fact, if we continue on this course, the 12 trillion will become 13 trillion in 2030. So we have food system that is heavily costly, and that is costing us more than it's benefiting us in many terms. Now, this is where the issue of mobilizing funds and mobilizing private investment in the agri-food sector come into the picture. I mean, when it comes to SDGs, it's been estimated that $4.5 trillion are needed US dollars per year. About 140 billion can come from development assistance. About 4 billion can come from philanthropists. So what about all the rest, right? And this is where we start thinking of the role of private sector in moving countries through their transformation, through the agri-food transformation, the role of private sector to raise our food systems, make them more efficient and less costly. In agriculture specifically, $140 billion are needed per year in additional financing, in addition to what's happening now. 90 billion of this is needed from the public sector, but 50 billion a year is needed from the private sector. So again, a huge role for the private sector if we talk about agri-food transformation, and if we talk about food systems that will meet the challenges of today and tomorrow. Now, in order to be able to mobilize private investment in agriculture, the enabling environment plays a key role. Those location-specific factors that shape opportunities and incentives for firms to invest productively, create jobs, and expand. And there's a number of conditions and a number of factors that need to be in place for such investments to take place. I've illustrated just a few here: policies, regulations, institutions, support services, infrastructure, and social capital. But quite honestly, there are many more. Now, I do want to, and looking at this phrase of a World Bank report in 2005, perhaps make a slight adjustment. And I hope I don't lose my job because of doing this, but I actually would redefine this as the factors that shape the opportunities and incentives, not only for firms, but the private sector at large. And we know that the private sector includes the millions of farmers, close to 500 million farmers around the world who invest, who produce, and who seek profitability. And they are part of the private sector. And these conditions are also heavily relevant, very relevant for them. Now, when it comes to this enabling environment, regulations and the legal framework play a key role. And that's where the concept of regulations, of smart and balanced regulations, come to the picture. Smart and balanced regulation means you don't want to, on the one hand, you do want to make sure that the regulations provide institutionality, information. They provide a framework for safety, quality, and standards, for property and management of property and land rights and environmental safeguards. But on the other side, if they are to be balanced, these regulations cannot be imposing excessive costs. They cannot be imposing burdensome processes and pushing the sector or actors within the sector into informality into informal processes, and reducing access to certain services or certain assets or inputs. So this issue of a smart and balanced regulations is key. Now, let me share with you, and as I start moving into the crux of my presentation, a few key concepts. The first concept is the importance of being able to measure. And there's a famous saying which goes as follows: you can only measure, let me say that again. You can only manage what you measure. So what you measure, and this is another way of looking at it, gets managed. And so a very clear example is this phenomenon of the fitness trackers, which over the last few years, perhaps decade or so, has really changed the mindset of individuals when it comes to measuring, monitoring, and improving their fitness and their performance. And so these are devices that have been provided, designed, allows you to, at any point, measure certain parameters. Based on those parameters, you are able to set goals and monitor progress, right? Now, why would such a concept not be as effective and as relevant when it comes to policies? And when it comes to, as we were discussing the regulations, the importance of the legal regulatory framework, the importance of this concept of being able to measure the legal and regulatory framework. What is a good one? What is a weak one? And what is one that demonstrates areas that requires improvement? Now, this is where we come to the concept of indicators. And indicators are basically this synthetic information, meaning that information, critical, crucial information, in this case about the legal and regulatory framework, that has been synthesized into quantitative measurements, right? So it allows you to quantitatively compare and measure elements of the legal and regulatory framework. And here I would like to present to you an initiative that I have co-led over the last 7 years. It's called Enabling the Business of Agriculture. And I want to talk a little bit about how this tool and this approach of being able to measure and monitor legal and regulatory frameworks can actually be critical for policy thinking and for policy change. Let me tell you a little bit about this project. So Enabling the Business of Agriculture, which I'll call EBA going forward, basically started in 2012. And you can see that it's produced every couple of years, on average, a report which covers a certain number of countries. We started with a smaller set. We've expanded to 101 countries. We are currently working with the latest results in moving forward policy engagement. These indicators, which as I expressed, they are this synthesis of critical information about the regulatory framework, cover a number of areas which you've selected. They could cover many more, but these are the 8 areas that we selected and that you see on your screen. Several inputs, several enablers, all of them critical and highly relevant when it comes to value chains within a country and investment decisions along those value chains. I won't go into too much detail, but we have, for each of these topics, we have the indicators, those circles, and we have additional data that we've collected that supplements those indicators. Within these sets of information, both the indicator and the additional information, we have areas that we look at. And just as an example, I'll mention seed. Within seed and the supply of seed, you can look at laws and regulations underpinning plant breeding and investment in plant breeding. You can look at laws and regulations underpinning variety registration and investment in variety registration. And you can look at seed quality control, right? And I'm not going to go through this list, but you can see how indicators are meant to synthesize and make it very easy to understand the status, a quick assessment of the status of, in this case, a regulatory framework, but at the same time carries the depth and the wealth of information that allows this data to inform policy analysis and dialogue and change. Now, an interesting feature is that with this project, we don't only look at regulations and what's in the books, the laws and regulations in the books, we actually measure what happens in practice. Because sometimes you might have good regulations in the books, but when it comes to practicing or implementing them, that's where you start seeing constraints for the private sector and for investment. And so, for example, in 4 of these indicator areas, we measure the processes, the efficiency of processes of, for example, registering a variety or registering a fertilizer, or in exporting food. I don't have the label there on trading food, but that's what we measure. Or tractor registration. Interestingly, in fact, and let me share an early result, is that countries that tend to have stronger regulations in the books also tend to implement them more efficiently. So you do see this correlation, but certainly there are exceptions. Now, what does this provide you? And here is my third concept. My first concept was the importance of measurement. My second concept was indicators, the ability to combine the synthesis information with a wealth of information. My third concept is the ability, the importance of being able to benchmark countries and compare countries. And so what does this indicator set produce? It produces a sort of scorecard or dashboard where you can see, this is just a sample, you can see within a country, what are some of the areas where there are gaps or weaknesses within the regulatory framework. In this case, you might think of seed and machinery, also plant health and livestock, and where are some of the areas where there's strengths. Although there can always be improvements, there are strengths and there are lessons learned in that country. In this case, perhaps securing water and registering fertilizer. Now, again, there's depth to this information because, in fact, that low score in supplying seed, if you go a little bit deeper, you'll notice that it's primarily due to the implementation. It's very costly, so you get a score of 0, and it takes quite a bit of time to be able to register a variety in this country. And so the score, when it comes to practice, is very low. While, again, there can be improvement on the regulations that are in the books, but that's certainly a stronger area in this particular country. Same thing with livestock, where you might divide it. You might look at the animal feed aspect of it, where regulations are weaker, and veterinary medicines, where regulations are stronger. Now, and this is where I delve into this third concept of the importance of benchmarking. These are the countries that we've covered with EBA. And this is the result, where those countries that appear darker are the ones that have higher scores and therefore stronger regulations, more balanced regulations for private sector investment in agri-food sector. Those that are lighter have lower scores and therefore are weaker when it comes to their regulatory frameworks. And so you start this exercise of comparing, and you start saying that even if you classify a country per their income group, within each income group, there is a natural progression that there is an association, let's say, I won't say correlation, between having stronger, more balanced regulations and higher income countries. But even within each cluster, within each income group, you'll see that there are countries that punch above their weight and countries that punch below their weight, right? And I'll take the lower middle income set. Kyrgyz Republic scores quite high for a country that can be found in that income group, same as Philippines, for example. Whereas perhaps Cameroon and Angola, they fall on the lower range when it comes to scores here. Now, this benchmarking, this measuring a country and ranking a country generates awareness and appetite. This is a country, I'll tell you straight up, this is Madagascar. As soon as a country such as Madagascar sees that it's ranked 83 out of 101, it really provokes some thinking. And as soon as it sees that within the 28 countries of Africa that is measured by this report, they rank 15, it provokes some thinking, right? And so here on the right hand of the screen, you start seeing that besides the scores, and these are the scores of Madagascar, you have the rankings, right? And you can see how within each of these areas, a country might compare to all the other countries being measured. And you can also see how this particular country compares to the regional average, which are the blue circles, and the global average, which are the yellow circles. And you can see in some case, it's above both averages. In some cases, it's below both averages. And for example, in plant health and trading food, it's actually above the regional average. But if it's going to set itself within a global context, it has a lot of progress that it can make and a lot of lessons that can be learned. And here we go. We take an example. This is for, I believe, trade, where essentially you can take a country. In this case, again, we have Madagascar. And you start saying, where is it when it compares to all the other 101 countries that have been measured? Now, if we think about South Asia, this is a summary slide. You can see the scores for each of the countries. You can see where India ranks beside the other countries. There might be a sense of satisfaction in terms of having, within the region, relatively strong, relatively robust, relatively balanced regulations. But it actually falls below the global average. It ranks 54 from 101 countries, which really kind of puts out a light, puts out an alarm that there is much to learn, there's much to improve, there's much more that can be done to stimulate private sector investment in the sector. And you can see the indicators on the right-hand side are indicators where in those countries regulations are particularly weak, meaning that scores are quite low. And here, there's other kinds of data that can be obtained from this data set. This is basically a few countries, Central Asian countries, and you can see the number of regulations that promote transparency and information, and how there are countries that have many regulations that promote that, such as Netherlands and Mexico. Some countries barely have any. There are countries that are somewhere in between. So you can also focus on, hone in on issues, particular issues, for example, in this case, transparency and information for the private sector. And it's very interesting because you can also compare neighboring countries, two countries that I visited back to back, where you cross the border, and from Kyrgyz Republic, for example, where it has a fertilizer score that's above the average, you move into Tajikistan where it's substantially below the average. Same thing in finance. But then when it comes to transport, you have stronger regulations in Tajikistan, you cross the border and you find weaker regulations. This, and this is my message here, this is what prompts policy thinking, policy appetite, and policy action. Here's another way of analyzing information, also two other countries that I did visit, and where they overlay, they find a country that they want to compare themselves to, Mozambique to Kenya, Kenya to Mozambique, and they start saying what areas are they stronger in, what areas are they weaker in. This is a natural trend. Athletes do it, academics do it. You want to know how you're doing beside your neighbor, your friend, or your rival in many cases when it comes to athletics. Now, to finish, in the last few minutes to finish this presentation, how does this translate into policy change, which is the ultimate kind of goal of this presentation, is talk about policy change. How can we foster that enabling environment which requires policy change? And here I have a map of the countries where engagement has either begun or has actually had some progress around the world. And you can see that countries pick up the kind of information, the kind of measurements that an initiative such as EBA provides. And they go through different phases, right? In the beginning, it's just awareness. It's just learning of the activity, learning of the initiative, and learning about the scores. But that leads to workshops, and discussions, and analyses. That leads to interests, and a formal interest, forming committees or working groups or incorporating into a strategy. That leads to projects that actually aim to change, aim to improve policies with the required investments. And that ultimately leads to reforms that can make environments more enabling for private sector investment. And here you see kind of a pipeline of countries moving through these processes, all being pushed forward by the evidence provided by EBA. This is just a graphic to demonstrate all the different things that EBA is prompting and provoking, all the way from projects financed by the World Bank, collaborative initiatives where many institutions, some of them global around the world, offshoot projects, national strategies, they become part of national strategies, and the formation of government working groups. Now, just to end here, I want to perhaps remember and remind what is the idea here. The idea is the provision of evidence, and this is where the concept of evidence-based policymaking, the provision of evidence can lead to awareness of issues. It leads to the provision of information. It can lead to interest in improving the enabling environment, improving the weaknesses. It can lead to actions to form or integrate into plans and projects. It can lead to reforms, and ultimately that leads to a number of processes that can improve the enabling environment. And we see that when you correlate, when you study the relationship between EBA scores and several outcomes like agricultural productivity, undernourishment, nourishment, and poverty, you actually start seeing relationships that shed light on the relevance of the issues that you're measuring. More directly and more specifically, you can see our scores for machinery, the EBA scores of machinery, and how they relate to actually tractor density within countries. Or, for example, regulations that come to livestock and how they relate to yields, in this case of milk, in the different countries. With that, my 30 minutes, which was my goal, are up. I hope this has been, to some degree, insightful, to some degree inspiring. My message is there are many opportunities to collect evidence and to use information to be able to improve our agri-food sector, to improve the environment, the enabling environment that will mobilize all the actors, but in this case, the private sector, which is a chief role, a key role in the sector, and ultimately improve our food systems and push our country, the agri-food sector in our countries, to transform and move forward. Thank you very much again for this opportunity, and I hope to meet you someday in person. All the best. Thank you.